Hello, third block. Just a reminder that your problems of the week are due tomorrow on Tuesday, and also that I will be here in my room from 7 to 8 o'clock tonight. If the doors are locked when you get here and you can't get upstairs, call my phone and I will come down and let you in. Let's start with the homework quiz for today. Put the answer to this question in the 6.4 box on your homework quiz sheet. Pause the video for about 5 minutes while you have a chance to work on this problem. All right, the answer to this homework quiz problem. The amplitude of that graph is 2, so there should be a 2 out front. It's starting at 0, so we know that it's going to be a sine graph. Sine graphs typically go up first. Since this one's going down first, we know it's going to be -2 out front to flip it over the x-axis. The period of this graph is 4 pi. We have the equation period equals 2 pi divided by b. So 4 pi equals 2 pi divided by b in this case. If you solve that equation for b, you get that b is 1/2. So in the parentheses, you should either have 1/2 x or x divided by 2. Now let's go over other questions that you have from the 6.4 homework. You can use the blue solutions manual or the blue teacher's guide to help you out. Ask the questions of other people in the room. If you're not satisfied with the answers, stop by my room from 7 to 8 o'clock tonight. All right, now we're going to finish up the section 6.5 notes. First, a quick review of the parts that we did in 6.5 on Friday. We talked about how if you were taking a parabola and you wanted to move it up, you would add 2 on the outside of the squared part. If you wanted to move it down, you would subtract 2 on the outside. Left and right movements are on the inside of the parentheses. We said it would be the exact same thing for sine and cosine graphs. Movements up and down were called vertical shifts. And movements left or right on a sine graph were called phase shifts. We did a few examples, and with each example that we did, we said there were 5 steps. First, we were going to start with marking the midline. That had to do with the vertical shift. Then we'd count up and down from there for the amplitude. We'd mark the period out on the x-axis, cut it in half again to get the 4 even spots. Then we'd use the phase shift to decide where the graph starts and follow the pattern. This is a graph that we did on Friday. We said that it has an amplitude of 3, a vertical shift of -1, and the period always equals 2 pi over b. So in this case, the period was pi. Following the steps, we started by marking the midline at -1. The amplitude is 3, so I'm going to count up 1, 2, 3 from there, and count down 1, 2, 3 from there. Then I'll go on the x-axis, mark the period, cut it in half, cut it in half again. To get that last marking, I'm going to count 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 3 pi over 4. This graph has no phase shift because they're not adding or subtracting anything on the inside. So it's just a normal cosine graphs. Cosine graphs usually start at the top. Then to the middle. The middle is not at 0 in this case. The middle is at -1. The bottom of the graph is at -4. Back to the middle. And then to the top. Here's one complete cycle of this cosine graph. We did this one on Friday. We also did the next one. For this next one, it has no vertical shift, so its midline is right at 0. Its amplitude was 1, so it went up to 1, down to -1. The x is not being multiplied by anything, so it has a normal period of 2 pi. Cut it in half again. To get the third one, we'll count 1/2, 2 halves, 3/2, 3 pi over 2. But this one does have a phase shift because it's adding or subtracting. We said to find the phase shift, we would set the part in parentheses equal to 0 and solve for x. Whatever value we get for x is the phase shift. In this case, set the part in parentheses equal to 0 and solve for x. The phase shift is negative pi. So that means this graph isn't going to start at 0. We're going to start back here at negative pi. It's a cosine graph, so at negative pi where it starts, it should be at the top. At negative pi over 2, we're in the middle. 0, we're at the bottom. Pi over 2, we're at the middle. And at positive pi, we're back at the top. There's one complete cycle of this graph. You could keep the pattern going if you wanted to, but for the test, you only need one complete cycle of the graph clearly marked. I think on Friday we also did this last one, y equals the cosine of 2x plus 2. But we changed it to y equals the cosine of 2x plus 2 pi is how it looks in your packet. This graph has a regular amplitude of 1. The period is pi. Remember, to get the period, we always set it equal to 2 pi divided by whatever x is being multiplied by, our value for b right there. So the period is pi. Vertical shift, nothing is being added or subtracted on the outside, so there's no vertical shift. For the phase shift, we set the part in parentheses equal to 0 and solve for x. 2x plus 2 pi, set it equal to 0, solve for x. This graph also has a phase shift of negative pi. To graph this, we are going to mark the midline, which is right at 0. Count up and down for the amplitude. Mark the period, cut it in half, and in half again. To get that last marking, we'll count pi over 4, 2 pi over 4. So this must be 3 pi over 4. Then we'll use the phase shift to decide where it starts. The phase shift is negative pi, so I need to go back to negative pi, and that's where this graph will start. It's a cosine graph, so it starts at the top, then it goes to the middle, bottom, middle, and top. This graph looks almost exactly like the last graph. The only difference is that the period is different. That's where we got to on Friday, so this one will be the first one that's new for today. Y equals the sine of 2x minus pi. Pause the video for a minute and see if you can figure out what's the amplitude, what's the period, a vertical shift, and a phase shift for this graph. The amplitude of this graph is 1. The period is 2 pi over 2, or just pi. There is no vertical shift on this graph. For the phase shift, set the part in parentheses equal to 0 and solve for x. This graph has a phase shift of positive pi over 2, so it's going to move right pi over 2. Let's follow the steps. Step 1, mark the midline. The midline has to do with the vertical shift. There is no vertical shift, so the midline's at 0. Then count up and down for the amplitude. The amplitude's 1, so we'll count 1 up and 1 down on the y-axis. Mark the period. The period is pi. Cut it in half. Cut it in half again. Half of a half is a fourth. That one's not on your graph paper, so you'll need to add it in. To get the third marking, we just need to count. 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4. This must be 3 pi over 4. Now we're ready to use the phase shift to decide where it starts. This graph is going to start at pi over 2. It's a sine graph, and sine graphs start in the middle. So I'll put a dot right at pi over 2, 0. It's a positive sine graph, so it's going to go up first, back to the middle, Now I have a choice. I can put some more markings on the x-axis and keep this graph going forward, or I can follow the pattern backwards and figure out where it would have been before. So if I wanted to go backwards, I'd know that at pi over 4, it's down here at -1, and 0, 0 would be the last point on this graph. If I wanted to go forward, I know that that's what the graph's going to look like, but I still need to mark these last two spots. I'm going to keep counting. 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4. This is 5 pi over 4. This last one would be 6 pi over 4, but that reduces to 3 pi over 2. Remember, for the test, you only need one complete cycle of the graph. So you can either have this part for your final answer, or you can have this part. Either way, it has one complete period or one version of the graph, here or here. Next graph in your packet, y equals -2 cosine of 2x minus pi over 2. Just like before, take a minute, see if you can figure out the amplitude, period, vertical shift, and phase shift for this graph. Once you have that part, start the video again. We'll make sure that you're right. Then we'll pause it again and see if you can do the graph on your own this time. So pause it and find those 4 important features. All right, so you should have already had a chance to figure out those 4 important parts. The amplitude is 2. If you put -2, you're not correct. The negative is just going to tell us that it reflected over the x-axis, but the amplitude is always positive, so the amplitude is +2. The period, 2 pi divided by 2, or just pi. The vertical shift, there is not a vertical shift because there's nothing being added or subtracted on the outside. For a phase shift, set the part in parentheses equal to 0 and solve for x. The phase shift is pi over 4. Now that you have that information and you have a chance to make sure that it's correct, use it to draw this graph on your own. All right, compare your graph to mine, starting with marking the midline. The midline's at 0. Then count up and down for the amplitude. The amplitude is 2, so we'll count up to 2 and down to -2. Mark the period. The period is pi. Cut it in half, and in half again. To get that third marking, we'll count 1/4, 2/4, 3 pi over 4, and use the phase shift to decide where it starts. The phase shift is pi over 4. This is a negative cosine graph. Cosine graphs usually start at the top. Because it's negative, it's going to start at the bottom. So this graph is going to start at pi over 4, comma -2. From there, it will go to the middle, then to the top, and back to the middle. Now that's not quite enough. We have 2 choices for how to finish this graph. We can either continue the pattern backwards and connect it back up to 0, 0, or we can continue the pattern forward and end down here. If we're going to continue it forward, we need to figure out what's the label for this last spot. 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4 is the last label. Let's do the same process with the last graph in your notes, the graph of y equals 4 times the cosine of x over 2 plus pi, and outside of the parentheses -6. Start with, on your own, trying to find the amplitude, period, vertical shift, and phase shift. After we've had a chance to compare answers on that, we'll pause again, and you can try to graph it on your own. All right, the amplitude, the number out front, is 4. The period is 2 pi divided by 1/2. When you have a fraction and a fraction, you multiply by the reciprocal. So the period is actually 4 pi in this case. Vertical shift up and down, this thing is shifted down 6. For the phase shift, take the part in parentheses, set it equal to 0, and solve for x. The phase shift is negative 2 pi. Pause the video again and try to graph this on your own now that you have the 4 important pieces of information about this graph. For this graph, we're going to start with marking the midline. The midline is at negative 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Probably on your graph paper, you might want to count by 2s, otherwise it's not going to fit very well. The amplitude is 4, so we need to count up 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, that's negative 2. And we need to count down 4. That's at negative 10. For full credit on your test, you need to clearly have labeled the midline, maximum, and minimum. Next step, mark the period. The period is 4 pi. Cut it in half again. The third one's easy to find on this one, 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi. Then use the phase shift to decide where it starts. It's going to start at negative 2 pi, so I need to mark where negative 2 pi is on the graph. This is a positive cosine graph. Positive cosine graphs start at the top. So negative 2 pi comma negative 2 is the first point on the graph. At negative pi, it's in the middle. At 0, we're at the bottom. Pi, we're at the middle. And at 2 pi, we're back at the top. That would be all we would need to graph to get one full period of this graph. Try the 3 graphs on the next page of the packet on your own. Pause the video until you've had a chance to do that. When you press play, I'll go straight to the answers for those 3 graphs. Here are the answers for those 3 graphs on the next page. Pause the video so you have a chance to take a look at them in detail and compare your work to what's up here. That's all there is for graphs in this section, but there is the part where you take a description of a graph and write an equation based on the description. Let's do one together and then one on your own. Pause the video while you have a chance to write down this question. Write the equation of a sine function with amplitude 4, period pi, phase shift negative pi over 8, and vertical shift 6. All right, here's what I like to do when I start these equations. I like to start with y equals some number, in this case sine of, and I like to leave a big space for my parentheses and then a blank at the end. The number that's going to go out front is going to be the amplitude. So this number right here is 4. Now technically it could be positive 4 or negative 4. So when you're comparing your answers in the book, you're going to see a plus or minus out here. Remember, amplitude is always positive, but this graph doesn't say whether it's a regular sine graph that goes up first or if it's a negative sine graph that's going to go down first from 0. The next part I like to take care of is the vertical shift, the number on the outside. The vertical shift is 6, so I'm going to add a plus 6 to the outside. The next step is going to be to take care of the period. The period is pi, and we have a formula that period equals 2 pi divided by b. Since the period is pi, we're going to say pi equals 2 pi divided by b, and we have to solve for b. Some people can see it in their head. For other people, multiply both sides by b, and then divide by pi. In this case, b equals 2. So it's 2x and then either plus or minus something, and we need to figure out what that something is. To figure that something out, we'll use the phase shift. Remember when we find the phase shift, we set the part in the parentheses equal to 0 and solve for x. So normally what we would do is set the part in the parentheses. Since I don't know what's being added or subtracted, for now I'm going to say plus c. If c ends up being a negative number, then I would change this equation to minus whatever I get for c. But I'm going to set what's in the parentheses, so 2x plus c equal to 0. Now normally what we would do is we would solve it for x, and whatever number we get for x is the phase shift. But we know the phase shift. The phase shift is negative pi over 8. So I'm going to plug that right there in for x. 2 times negative pi over 8 plus c equals 0. Now I'll be able to figure out what c is. Let's see, 2 is like 2 over 1, so when I multiply I get negative 2 pi over 8 plus c equals 0. You might reduce that to negative pi over 4. I'm going to add that to both sides, so I'm going to add pi over 4 to both sides. And I get a c value of positive pi over 4. That's the number that's going to fill in this last little part in the parentheses. There are 2 correct answers to this. One correct answer is y equals positive 4 times the sine of 2x plus pi over 4 outside of the parentheses plus 6. The other answer would be the negative 4. So negative 4 times the sine of 2x plus pi over 4 outside the parentheses plus 6. Remember the steps. Start with the amplitude out front and the vertical shift at the end. Then use the equation period equals 2 pi over b to figure out what number b is. Once you have b, take the part in the parentheses, set it equal to 0. You know that the answer for x is going to be the phase shift, so plug the phase shift right in for x to get your number for c. Use those same steps to try to do this one on your own. Pause the video while you have a chance to try this example. All right, in this case, it's y equals, leave a space, cosine of, big gap for parentheses, and leave a space at the end. The amplitude is 3, so that'll go out front. Remember, it can be positive or negative 3. The number at the back is the vertical shift. That's a negative 1. Then I'll use the period is 4. So I'm going to set the period is 4 pi. I'll set 4 pi equal to 2 pi over b and solve for b. To solve, I'll multiply both sides by b and divide by 4 pi. b is 1/2. So I either have 1/2 x or x over 2. Now I need to figure out what the c is, what's being added or subtracted. So I'm going to set the part in parentheses equal to 0. And when I would solve this for x, the answer I'd get for x is the phase shift. So I'm going to put pi in for x, since pi is the phase shift. In this case, c equals negative pi over 2. So I'm going to plug negative pi over 2 right there in the parentheses, and that's my equation. Y equals plus or minus 3 times the cosine of x over 2 minus pi over 2, and outside of the parentheses, minus 1. Another topic in this section is compound functions. We're going to skip that. That won't be covered on the test next Monday at all. Your homework in section 6.5 is on page 383. You have the rest of class time today to work on that homework.